The Deadzone Containment Protocols from Mantic Games.
Nothing Personal by Greg D. Smith. Petter pressed the door chime, tensing as the intercom buzzed into life and the impatient tone of Executive Vostok rang out.
Ivan Slavic, this had better be important, you understand?
Even disembodied through the speaker, the voice lost none of its authority or arrogance. Petter flinched as if struck.
Oh, yes, sir. I'm very sorry, but you made it clear that you wished to be told,
Stop your jabbering and get in here. I don't have all day.
The door clicked open, and Petter hurried inside, clutching the data packet to him like a shield. The office was large, easily enough to accommodate Petter's entire home. No paintings or fine art adorned the walls, no carpet covered the floor. Everything shone with a mirror finish, every surface a polished onyx black. Vostok sat behind a desk which functioned as a huge data screen, putting at the executive's fingertips a whole wealth of information relating to Sun Fei business across the GCPS. Petter walked as quietly as possible across the black tiles, coming to a halt before the desk, and stood waiting. Vostok was busily scrolling through some important data, fingers making deft little movements as she flicked from one entry to the next. Petter stood in silence for several minutes. He began to wonder if Vostok had forgotten that he was there. It had happened before, and he elected to risk a cough.
Are you dying, Ivan Slavic?
The question fired out like a gunshot in the silence of the chamber. In spite of himself, Petter jumped. He took a step forward to the desk and held out the data packet, forcing his voice to remain steady as he delivered the news.
It would appear there is a bit of a problem at the facility on Nexus I, sir. All contact has been lost, and the planet itself appears to be deleted from the NavCorp.
Vostok's head shot up, pinning him in place with a fierce glance.
When did this happen?
It's approximately an hour and 37 minutes since the last transmission, sir.
There was an agonizing pause as Vostok sat there staring at him. Ill-contained anger radiated from the woman in a palpable aura.
Tell me, Ivan Slavic. When I said tell me immediately if we lose contact with any of our operations in the Fifth Sphere, was I in some way unclear?
Sir, the data was...
Save me your excuses.
Vostok dismissed his explanation with a curt wave.
We have no further time to waste. What was the last recorded transmission from the facility?
Petter proffered the data packet towards the executive.
This is a transcript of the last transmission, sir.
Vostok snatched the data packet and opened it, eyes flicking back and forth as she went down the page. She stopped as she found the very words she had been hoping for. Monsters. Infection. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. 5 years of placing small and fairly pointless research stations on every settled backwater mudball in the Fifth Sphere had paid off at last.
Very well, Ivan Slavic. Thank you for your belated delivery of this news.
She brought up a new window on the desk and began tapping in a series of authority codes to send a message to a secure channel. She'd need to act fast, or the opportunity would be lost.
Tell me, Ivan Slavic, have you been keeping up with your xenology studies?
Petter looked confused. He didn't see the link between the one and the other. Vostok sighed. It was so difficult to work with normal people. She often forgot just how much slower they were. As an orc was to an average human, so the average human was to Danislava Vostok.
The Marauders, Ivan Slavic. The special assignment I gave you? Have you been keeping up with the studies, yes or no?
Yes, sir, for the last 6 months. Oh, I am well versed in the dialects and traditions and preferred social customs of the Orcish mercenaries, as well as their habits.
I don't need the details. A simple yes will suffice. Today is your lucky day, Ivan Slavic. Today you are going to start using those talents for the good of the Sun Fei Corporation. Play this right, and there will be a healthy promotion in it for you.
Petter stood there for a few seconds, brow knitted, and mouth hanging slack as his brain desperately looked for the part of the conversation it had missed.
That'll be all, Ivan Slavic. You will receive further instructions in due course.
Petter flinched as the rusted tannoy system blared the announcer's voice to the bar. Distracted by the screeching feedback, he stumbled into one of the patrons. He backed away, hands held up apologetically. The hulking brute spared him a single glance before turning back to his conversation. He coughed, the thick fog of smoke cloying in his lungs. He didn't frequent bars at all, and even if he had, he wouldn't have frequented one such as this by choice. The kind of bar that sprang up around unlicensed dreadball games was the last sort of place he would have come under his own volition. Even if this place hadn't been on a planet in the back end of nowhere, Out at the fringe of civilization, he couldn't have felt less at home. At least his journey had been uneventful enough. The advantage of having a boss as well connected as Vostok was that transport anywhere was discreet, quiet, and luxurious. Now came the hard part. As he mingled with the very dregs of frontier society, looking for the perfect band for his requirements. After 7 fruitless hours combing the so-called classier establishments of this backwater world, he was reduced to being here, among the kind of scum that even other scum wouldn't wish to associate with, aliens and pirates, thieves and murderers. This really was his last resort. At last his eyes alighted on exactly what he needed, and he breathed a sigh of relief. A group of no more than a dozen orcs of various shapes and sizes, huddled together in a corner of the bar next to the makeshift pitch. What the patrons would have called the good seats, close enough to smell the blood, and even shed some of your own if you were unlucky. He thought back to his training.
When dealing with the orc, always look for the smallest among their number. Known as goblins or stunts, these creatures exhibit a crude intelligence that far outstrips their bigger cousins. It is to them that any initial questions or suggestions should be directed.
Bracing himself, he set off towards them, winding as best he could through the sweaty bodies of various shapes, size, and species. As he drew closer, he found what he was looking for. Perched on an overturned bucket practically under the table, the goblin would have been easy enough to miss. Beady eyes peered out from a mean little face, dominated by a hooked nose. A thin mouth seemed set in a permanent sneer, a small cheroot dangling loose and unlit from one corner.
Orc society is governed by strict protocols and concept of respect and honor. One should never attempt to address an orc directly, unless first invited to do so. When addressing an orc, eye contact should be avoided at all times, as should any sudden movements which may be interpreted as a threat display. On no account attempt to replicate the language of the orcs. They take very poorly to such insults.
The group stopped talking for a moment as they noticed him. Narrow eyes flicked over and dismissed him as neither threat nor entertainment, and they went back to their huddle. The goblin reached into its nose with a long finger, working around the crevice with great enthusiasm. It examined the lump it extracted, then flicked it away. Petter cleared his throat. The goblin looked up. Petter couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in his crosshairs. Fighting for calm, he concentrated on roughening his voice, modeling it on the way he had heard manual laborers talking to one another in the dockyards, just as he'd been taught.
All right. I heard your crew is maybe looking for work. Wondered if I could talk to your captain?
The goblin didn't even blink, staring at him for long seconds. Behind him, the table full of orcs were talking even more loudly. Though he'd learnt the dialects, he didn't recognize the one they were using. The little creature heaved an exaggerated sigh, replying through clenched teeth. The cheroot bobbed as he spoke.
Maybe. What's in it for us? Catch a spare of you?
The voice was surprising, as rough as he'd expected, but oddly high, almost falsetto.
The orcs have no concept of monetary wealth per se. The mercenaries known as Marauders are notoriously greedy. They are, however, easily confused by large numbers and shiny objects. Well, might have.
A little shrug, with as much feigned nonchalance as he could muster.
All depends on what your crew can do.
The goblin cackled at that. It wasn't a pleasant sound.
Tell me what needs doing, and maybe you'll get us to speak with the cap.
Petter gave an elaborate look over his shoulder and lowered his tone as he leaned in.
Bit of trouble out there on the frontier. Next is Psy. Need a team who can sort it out. No questions.
The goblin stiffened at the mention of the name. A hunger blossomed in those eyes. The name meant something to it. Rumors were rife, of course, and Petter himself didn't know exactly the truth of half of them. Clearly, the goblin had his own opinion. Petter fought to keep his face neutral, waiting for the goblin to make the first move.
What's the job? And how much?
Petter paused a second before answering.
Just something needs to be taken care of. Quick and quiet. Pay is good.
The goblin eyed him a moment. Peter could almost hear the cogs turning in the primitive little brain.
Come back in half an hour. Match will be over by then, and maybe the cap will have time to hear you out. No promises, though.
With that, the goblin looked away, returning to the hidden delights of the other nostril, with another hook-like digit. Petter stood there, feeling a little bit foolish. It felt as though he'd been dismissed. But he was out of his depth here. He left it a minute, then turned on his heel and walked out of the bar, fighting the urge to run with every step. Had he not been so distracted, he might have noticed several pairs of bloodshot eyes swiveling to watch him like targeting lasers as he left. The bar was almost empty, the game long since finished. Only the orcs remained, their own distinctive odor adding to the rich bouquet of blood, sweat, and stale alcohol that draped over the place. Brindle sat on the floor of the bar, leaning against a wall. The various parts of his rifle lay neatly disassembled on an oily rag beside him, and he was currently working with a tool with great care into the barrel. He always cleaned the weapon at moments like these. The orcs tolerated him, sure enough, but he had little part in this discussion. The human had departed hours since, having explained his requirements to them in that laughable quavering voice of his. It had been all any of them could do to keep a straight face as the pink-skin had jabbered on. They'd played the role he expected, making nonsense sounds at each other as if conversing, while the little goblin translated, negotiating the final payment numbers with use of discreet hand signals from the captain. 5 million creds had been agreed with no argument, in itself odd. Now they were debating the job they'd been offered. As usual, Brindle was being a picky sheck. Part of the reason why Cap kept him around, Brindle was sure. Having someone about to question everything kept him thinking.
What I want to know is why they don't want to do it themselves. He didn't so much as blink when we said 5 million creds. Either he's lying about the money, or there's something more going on. They could buy an army for that kind of cash.
The Cap took a long pull on his oversized cigar.
Judging by his suit, the money, and the place he wants us to go, all quiet-like, I'd say he's corporation.
They exchanged glances at that. What he said made sense. A corporate job meaning many things. Money, power, opportunities. It also meant nothing would be straightforward. They began to mutter amongst themselves. The Cap cleared his throat, and they all fell silent.
It's simple. What they want us to do is too easy for what they're offering. Clearly there's more going on here than just a clueless sheck let on. So we go to this Nexus side, grab whatever we can, and then head to this meetup they've got arranged, tooled up, and ready for trouble.
They all murmured their agreement. They all knew well enough how the corporations worked. Devious brains that corkscrewed all over the place. It made sense, though. When you were as pink and squishy as humans, how else would you get by in the galaxy? Brindle hugged his arms tight around his wiry frame, rubbing himself as he shivered. His breath was white mist before him, drifting away to evaporate into the frigid air of the ship's bridge. Running silent meant running cold, in a literal sense, as all the systems bar atmospheric recyc were cut. Aside from the intake of breath, the faint serration of the scrubbers filtering the air was the only sound to be heard. The Cap stood, ramrod straight, at the front viewport. His hands were clasped behind him, and he stared unblinking at the sleek Enforcer ship hanging in the void before them. Next to the boxy, simple lines of their ship, an obsolete military cutter, the blockade craft was a deadly killer, as lethal as it was beautiful, and there were dozens more like it out there. They'd been coasting like this for hours now, having jumped in outside any sensor sweeps from the picket. Now they were so close, and all he could think about was getting on the dropship and getting warm again. Brindle always appreciated the somewhat elevated status his skills afforded him amongst the crew, but at times like this, he was reminded just how big the gulf between him and them. It wasn't that the orcs didn't feel the cold, it just wasn't important to them. Things like comfort were secondary concerns when there was a job to be done. He'd seen orcs shrug off a loss of a limb in a fight. A drop in temperature was a simple irrelevance. A light on the panel before the Cap winked to amber, giving them the signal that they passed through the small gap in the cordon that the human had promised them would be there. Though there wasn't a sound, Brindle felt the tension on the bridge slip down several notches. The Cap turned on his heel without a word, nodding to the crew. As one, they picked up their weapons and packs and headed for the launch bay. Brindle picked up his own bundle and followed them. His rifle was safe in its watertight case, cleaned and disassembled together with stand, scope, spare barrels, and tools. His fingers hadn't been anywhere near steady enough in the cold to assemble it to his satisfaction. Besides, he'd need something to do to while away the journey to the surface. Corporal Logan wiped his face with the back of his hand, noting with a sigh that it came away caked in soot and rancid sweat. Without thinking, he checked the clip on his rifle again. Full charge. That should have been comforting, but then, supplies weren't really an issue. He had charge clips, food, water, and medical supplies to last for weeks, all in a pile of supply crates at the center of the rooftop. They'd been left there to make room on the last lander for the damn scientists. That had been 2 weeks ago.
Remain here. Hold this facility and await extraction.
He had overheard the orders being given to Sergeant Albin that day. and now they echoed in his mind. No further explanation had been forthcoming, but they'd all heard the stories. Beasts abroad in the jungles, hunting down men, women, and children without discrimination. Albin had been dismissive.
Even if the tales are true, they sound like a load of dung to me. We've got a fortified position here, lads,
he declared, his tone full of confidence. That had been his biggest mistake. When they came, the beasts were far worse than the stories. The biggest, the leader, they guessed, strode in their midst, twice as tall as a man, and festooned with bony spikes. Enormous arms ended in clawed hands, the size of ground car wheels. Smaller, nimbler ones loped ahead, like primates on all four elongated limbs. Dubbed hunters by advanced patrols, they covered ground at an alarming rate. Logan had seen one punch Albin's head clean off his shoulders. It hadn't even paused, loping forward without so much as a glance back as the body toppled to the ground. At first, ignoring the stories of a hostile virus, Logan had convinced himself that the creatures were alien beasts. That had changed when he'd seen the ones that were recognizably human. Dressed in the rags of a Sun Fae laborer uniform, name tag still attached, the sight had brought up a sickening realization. If it could happen to them, it could happen to him. It also meant they were dealing with an enemy that was smart, able to use weapons, and open doors. With the Sarge dead, Logan had taken charge of what little remained of his unit, pulling them back towards the rooftop extraction point. They had fought as best they could, but one by one they had fallen, until only he remained. He blocked the staircase as best he could, and used a portable welder from the stack of supply crates to steal the Neridorium hatch, and now he sat here, waiting for the end. He gazed up at the sky, lost in this train of melancholy thought, the sporadic sounds of gunfire from below no longer registering. It had been like this for several days now, the wretches letting off rounds, more in apparent hope than expectation. At first he ducked with the sound of every shot. After several days, he learned to recognize when he was being fired at, and when they were just loosing some shots at random. He became aware of movement among the clouds. Something was coming down fast and hard. He brought up his scope, and squinted through it, the detail of the sky dizzying as he fought to focus on the object. Then he had it, a ship dropping like a stone through the clouds. He zoomed in as much as he could, taking the boxy, hard lines that spoke of something old and probably cheap. There was a sudden flare from the engine pods, and the craft began to arrest its descent. It was turning now, and he realized with mounting tension that it was heading for him. He wiped sweat from his eye and put the scope back into it, squinting hard and dialing the focus ring. His heart leapt for one stupid, naive moment as he imagined rescue coming for him at long last. Then the craft came into sharper focus, and he noted the matte black paint, the functional, brutal weapon pods hard-mounted to the flat surfaces, and finally the grinning face of the pilot, dirty yellow fangs showing stark against grimy face. Marauders. He'd stayed here defending this bloody facility from the infected for days on end, watching good people die around him, only to see it all getting taken away by a bunch of bloody pirates. He was surprised by the realization they didn't care as much as he thought he would. A clang from behind him caused him to jump, almost dropping the scope, heard scraping sounds, and even the occasional bullet strike from the hatch since he'd sealed it, as the wretched half-human members of the enemy, some of them his own ex-squadmates, had tested the defenses. This was different though. The sound had rung out like a hammer striking a bell. As he looked around, the stairway hatch buckled outwards under a second blow. The hatch had been designed to stop a military-grade rocket at short range. He had nowhere left to run. There was no way off the roof that wasn't terminal, and no way back through the facility now. He ran to the far end of the roof and huddled down under his heat exchanger. If he could just wait it out, there was the tiniest chance that the pirates and the monsters would deal with each other. The craft came to a halt overhead, hovering with a whine of engines fighting against the pull of gravity. Side hatches were thrown open, and rappel lines dropped to the rooftop, followed by creatures of various sizes. The smallest, less than half the size of the others, scampered over to the heat exchanger next to the one under which Logan cowered, kneeling down and unslinging the rifle across its bony back. For one heart-stopping moment, he thought he'd been spotted, and that the creature was headed for him. He breathed a sigh of relief as the goblin settled into a firing position, eye to the scope, as he scanned the ground below. The other orcs were already hefting a mixture of guns and bladed weapons, flexing their muscles and looking around, tense and alert. Logan had heard stories of the orcs. Of course, who hadn't? But he'd never seen them in the flesh before. They were far bigger and more opposing than even the wildest exaggerations had suggested. Heavy set, their huge protruding jaws and receding foreheads gave them a primitive look. But there was an intelligent gleam in their eyes, which marked them as more than simple thugs. After 2 weeks of fighting the plague, Logan hadn't expected to see anything else that could unnerve him more. He'd been wrong. The hatch gave way with a final crash, and the huge infected emerged from the hole it had created, roaring its defiance. It stomped onto the roof and stopped, taking in the sight of the unexpected orcs with an almost quizzical look. 2 of the hunters appeared behind it, loping forward on their knuckles, sniffing the air. Behind them, there was the suggestion of many of the humanoid beasts, though how many was impossible to tell. The orcs, for their part, stood ready but unmoving, waiting for a signal. Neither side seemed willing to make the first move. The leader of the orcs, obvious by his long black greatcoat with its gaudy brocades, and his peaked officer's cap, broke the stalemate with a chopping motion of his right hand. There was a sound like tearing silk, which seemed to come from above, and a line of tiny explosions erupted along the roof, bisecting one of the hunters and leaving both halves flopping wetly to the ground. Logan ducked further, recognizing the sound of a chain cannon when he heard it. The lead infected roared, and the huddle of infected behind it seemed to wake up, firing off shots that had the orcs diving for cover. A mixture of laser rounds and bullets spanked off the ground and the various bits of shelter the orcs had taken. They began to return fire, disciplined and organized, using short bursts of clattering, automatic fire to suppress the enemy. The surviving hunter surged forwards, bounding towards the orc captain. The big orc stood his ground, looking oddly unfazed amongst the fusillade enveloping him. There was a whip crack from beside Logan, and the hunter's head exploded, blood and brain matter drenching the roof. The body lolloped on for a few more feet before inertia dropped it in a tangled heap. The biggest beast was already moving, picking up speed as it thundered across the rooftop towards the pirates. The tearing silk sound came again, painfully loud this time, and a line of bloody craters stitched their way up the body of the creature. Despite the injuries, it kept coming. Another whip crack rang out, a shot striking the monstrous head, and throwing out a fine mist of blood and shattered teeth. The other orcs brought their weapons to bear, solid shots chewing into the heavy frame of the beasts, robbing it of momentum as it fought through the tide of lead. It came within inches of the mercenary leader when the whip crack rang out again, a third and final time. The bullet struck the creature through its left eyeball, the explosive round detonating inside the brain pan. Headless, its body slumped forward, the orc's leader neatly sidestepping to avoid the crashing bulk as it hit the deck. The rest of the infected seemed to lose interest with the death of their leader, and they retreated back down the staircase, occasional bursts of fire, more for show than intent, as they went. For their part, the orcs seemed to have no inclination to follow them, emerging from their various cover to stand by their leader. Logan kept his hand over his mouth, willing his heart to beat quieter and his breathing to slow. If he could just wait it out until the orcs got what they had come for and left.
Hello, Pinkskin. Enjoying the show?
Stinking breath washed over him as the goblin whispered in his ear, and he felt the careful but insistent pressure of a knife in the area of his groin. He let out a shuddering breath and waited for the end. He was lifted out of his hiding space by powerful arms and dumped on the floor. Opening his eyes and squinting against the glare of the sun, he felt a shadow pass over him, and found he was looking up at the orc captain, who was still smoking a cigar with the air of incredible calm. It took him a moment to realize he was being asked a question.
Sorry?
I said, have you got the key for the data archive? Only it'll save a lot of time and trouble.
Logan spluttered. He wasn't really sure what was happening.
I don't know what you're talking about. What data? The science team pulled out 2 weeks back. They took everything with them. We were just holding on for extraction.
The orcs looked at one another. He could tell that this was news to them, though they didn't seem entirely surprised, more intrigued. One of the orcs spoke up.
Looks like we wasted a trip, Chief.
The captain looked at him, and there seemed to be some unspoken conversation between them.
No such thing where the corporations are concerned. It's just a case of finding something else they'll pay us for.
They both grinned, turning to look down at Logan. Stars winked at Petter from the bridge view screen of the brazen moon. The signal from the orcs confirming that they had accomplished their mission and were en route had come through 4 hours, 19 minutes, and 37 seconds ago. That the data they retrieved was worthless had apparently escaped the brutes, just as intended. The plan was simple. The orc ship would be crippled the moment it arrived, and they would board it and take their prize. The moon was the pride of the Sun Fae fleet, and if anyone cared to ask his opinion, he would have said it was overkill. From what he had seen of the orc ship, it was a ramshackle mess, in as poor maintenance as one might expect. By comparison, the moon was a sleek, sophisticated killer, not as big as the war cruisers of Acutech's fleet arm, or the mega haulers of Almar Interplanetary perhaps, But Sun Fei was yet young, and its star very much an ascendant. A single salvo from its batteries would be sufficient, followed by a quick boarding action, and then they would have what they needed, and he could get back home. The wail of a klaxon drew him sharply back to the present, and he looked to the captain of the vessel, hoping for some kind of explanation. The officer had gone very pale, and a bead of sweat was running down the side of his face. He looked up at Petter, opening his mouth to speak, when the lights on the bridge went dark, and a red tinge suffused everything. A different klaxon blared to accompany the first, creating a discordant harmony that battered his ears. In the dim emergency lighting, the crew looked worried. Petter looked around, hoping that someone would catch his eye and explain to him what was going on. He chanced to look at the screen of the tactical officer to his right. The words "Translation Proximity Warning" in flashing red letters did nothing to calm him. When the port and starboard doors opened, and the soldiers began to appear on the bridge, weapons held ready, he knew something was very wrong indeed. There was a bright flash on the view screen. Suddenly, where there had been empty space, there was a ship that he recognized in an instant. It was York's craft, as expected, but something was wrong. It was already far too close, coming straight at them, and showing no signs of slowing. Petter just had time to reach for a nearby safety rail before the impact came. With a crash that reverberated through his gut, hard enough to make him nauseous, and a long drawn-out scream of metal, the two vessels collided. Petter was thrown to the deck, hitting his head hard as he fell. Reaching up, he felt warmth and wetness on his hand, and stared in horrified fascination at the blood coating his fingers. The awful noise continued, the two ships scraping together in a horrific embrace. He could just make out the screams of the wounded and shouts of soldiers over the sound of his own pulse racing in his head. He tried to stand, but was knocked down again by a crew member rushing past him. Earning a curse he didn't quite catch. The bridge seemed to be getting darker, and the noise around him was dissolving into a general buzz that filled his ears like static. His eyes snapped open to the sound of yelling, screaming, and gunfire. He wasn't sure how long he'd been out. It felt like only seconds, but the noises surrounding him suggested otherwise. The klaxons had stopped, and smoke drifted eerily in the red glow that still suffused the bridge. There was something else his brain was screaming at him to notice, something more important than the blood and the pain and the dizziness. He shook his head to clear it, and then wished he hadn't as a fresh wave of nausea rolled over him. He couldn't think. He couldn't grasp what it was. And then he didn't need to. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up into a broken, scarred face from his worst nightmares. The battle lasted a little over an hour. The defenders were well trained, well armed, and brave enough, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. They believed what the corporations had told them, taking the orcs for simple brutes, incapable of intelligent thought, and no match for them. It was a mistake that Captain Brando was always happy to exploit. He pushed a trembling, whimpering human officer out of her chair and made himself comfortable. With a contented sigh, he struck a match and lit the end of his cigar. Petter was transfixed, staring in horrific fascination at the apparition before him. This was all wrong. Surely nothing more than a bad dream. The brute was sitting on the bridge of the finest ship that the Sun Fei Corporation had to offer, and it didn't even seem scratched.
You look upset.
The voice, when it came, shocked him even more. It was deep and resonant, yes, but also clear and enunciated. The damn thing sounded almost cultured.
Not surprising, really. Though you've hired stupid muscle. Didn't expect us to outthink you.
The orc reached out with a boot and nudged the vacant chair next to his own.
Come on, up you get.
Petter simply stayed where he was on the floor, too dumbstruck to move or speak. The orc reclined back with a sigh of blue smoke and a slow shake of his head.
Please yourself. Look, you tried to play us. We killed all your soldiers so's you not to try that again. Now we're square. So, how about we get down to business?
Petter's mind was rebelling. His ears were telling it things that it simply couldn't cope with. He didn't realize he'd spoken out loud, until the orc laughed with a snort and then replied,
Don't shake me about. You don't come to pick up point in a gunboat this size unless you mean to use it. You sent us down there to get infected. You know we can carry it, even though we're immune. Thought you'd knock us out of the sky, freeze us, and ship us back to your labs.
The orc took a drag of his cigar.
Stop me if I'm wrong.
Petter opened his mouth to respond, but was hushed with a wave of a large green hand.
Don't bother. I've seen the cryopods lined up in your hangar bay. Nice big biohazard symbols everywhere. Also, I saw what you were working on in your precious research station. Spoke to a former employee of yours who was more than happy to give us a tour when we realized he'd been left there as monster bait.
He leaned back and blew a smoke ring out with a contented sigh, watching the grey wisp drift up into the darkness of the ceiling. Petter considered his position for a moment, then spoke up. He was surprised by how normal his voice sounded.
So you're gonna kill me and take the ship?
The orc pulled himself forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked the man straight in the eye.
You know, I could. I can kill every Shek and pigskin I find on board. Get my pilot up there and haul it to the nearest port to bring in a full crew. Or maybe I could sell it. I get a decent price for a ship this size with a full crew of slaves already in place.
Petter felt the color drain from his face.
That's one way we could do it. I think there's a better way. We're gonna take this ship, and we're gonna speak to whoever your bosses are. I doubt they'll give a flying Shek about what happens to you. But I bet they care what happens to the ship and its crew. That puts us in a strong position to negotiate.
The smile that emerged on the orc's face was a jagged, feral thing.
I reckon they'll be willing to give us a fair price for its safe return. Probably double what we get out there. More to the point, we just seized their top ship. 7 of us. I'd say they'd find a use for us if they have any sense.
Petter couldn't stop himself. From out of nowhere, he began to laugh. It was good, cleansing, and soothing. But it didn't stop there. It went on for so long that it became something else, something wild and out of control. All his years of drudgery, the years of fighting the urge to tell his self-important superiors where to shove it, and now this brute was going to bring them all down to his level. When the laughter finally subsided, he looked up again at the big orc, who was watching him intently, cigar clamped in his oversized jaws. Wiping the tears from his eyes, he pulled himself to his feet and brushed the dust from the cheap jacket he had been wearing for business excursions ever since he graduated from the Sun Fae Workers' Orientation Program 5 years previous. Taking a moment to compose himself, he stuck out his hand formally, as if to a business associate.
Let's start over, shall we? My name is Peter Ivan Slavic, and it would be my absolute pleasure to introduce you to my employers.